Hi, and welcome to all future mentors at MSF. This video focuses on mentoring across cultural differences. How do we best mentor someone from a different cultural background than our own? My name is Henry Singleson. I have worked for 20 plus years in the cross-cultural field for large multinationals around the world. If you take, say, 150 travel days a year for 20 plus years, worked in almost 100 countries. A lot of focus on global leadership, multinational teams and boards, and cross-cultural collaboration. 10 years ago, I started doing work for the UN, soon after with MSF, when Joanne Liu became the president of MSF. We did some work on governance and strategy, and a couple of years ago, I worked with some of the previous expats and future expats here in Scandinavia, attended the Global HR conference in Barcelona. And since then, I've done a lot of work across many parts of MSF with this cross-cultural or collaboration focus, particularly the Access campaign, some part of the Recruitment Assessment Center in Oslo, and the Coaching and Mentoring Hub. As we're focusing on here, some work with the TIC project on diversity, inclusion, and equity, and many different functions within OCB. It's a great pleasure to serve MSF through this way. So our focus here is on international cultural differences and how we collaborate together with counterparts from different parts of the world, or how we work together. Let me give a couple of examples. So let's say you're having a conversation with a colleague from Syria or a colleague from India, or you're managing a team of people from DRC, from Spain, from Afghanistan, from Japan. They're coming together. That's your team. Or maybe you're in procurement negotiations with a local supplier in Haiti and Yemen, or let's say you're establishing relationships with colleagues on your mission in Lebanon or in Central America, etc. Or you are mentoring across cultures. One day you're mentoring a Japanese colleague, the next day a colleague from Palestine, third day a colleague from Mozambique, and later that day you're with a colleague from Bolivia. There are many cultural differences at play as you're interacting with them. And let me just give an example. So a first example, and perhaps most obvious example, is a difference in communication style. I come from a very direct culture here in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries. Also, cultures like Germanic cultures, France, some Francophone cultures are relatively direct on a global comparison. The more indirect cultures are maybe in the Philippines. This could be Myanmar, Thailand. This could be in South Sudan. This could be Chad. There are a number of cultures in the world that are much more indirect, or avoiding the confrontation, making sure that they preserve the harmony, the relationship between us in the interaction. So that's a typical example of the kind of cultural differences we're going to talk about today. As we mentor someone from a different cultural background, we need to really be aware of this kind of cultural difference, for example, in communication style like that. We also need to have an understanding of the why behind the behavior. It's not just enough to know about it, but we really need to understand the depth of what that means for someone from that culture. Because I think if we don't really understand it or strive to understand it, it's more difficult to appreciate it, to respect it, to accept it in our interaction. So picture a mentee is kind of pushing back or hesitant to go have a conversation with someone about a difficult topic. We need to understand that if this is a person from an indirect culture, this is actually the acceptable norm. This is something we can appreciate, that they would do it in a different way, so that our mentoring can take that into consideration. But in my experience, this awareness, understanding, and acceptance of cultural difference is actually not enough. We need to be standing on that as a foundation, but also make a solid sort of judgment call as to say, okay, I understand that your style is more indirect, his or her style is more direct. What do we do in this situation? It may not be comfortable for you, but say you are from the Philippines, typical example of one of the world's most indirect communications cultures. But now this person is interacting with a counterpart from Germany, would be a good example. German culture in general, compared to the Philippines, is much more direct, much more confrontational. So our mentoring could take that into consideration and encourage, champion them to go have that direct conversation. It may be uncomfortable for them. We can help them with that. We can support that, but it would be normal in for the German counterpart to have that conversation. And picture the mirror example. So someone from a German background we're mentoring, and they're going to have a conversation with their counterpart from the Philippines, and just put it on the table, hash it out, have the conversation, talk it through. We need to be able to mentor and say, well, when you work at MSF, when you work internationally on a mission, you may have to take that into consideration. So if I now tell you that the Philippines is the world's most indirect culture, would you go about it differently? Would you do something differently? And that brings me to sort of the highest states here, if you will, or state. We may have to evaluate how we do it in a particular situation, but we also need a strategy, a tactic, sort of, okay, this person is direct, I'm indirect. What do I do? How do I go about it? Do I adapt? Do we meet in the middle? Do we sort of just be ourselves and articulate that explicitly? Do I support this whole difference with strong relationship building? What do I do? Now, communication style differences is just the beginning. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I would say hierarchy, relationship, and case-by-case logic are probably some of the deepest cultural differences that really impact our success in mentoring across cultures. Let me start with hierarchy. On the one hand, we have very egalitarian cultural views. Yes, I may be the manager, but I'm not much different in my status or my experience level than my counterpart. I may be the mentor, but I don't know more than my mentee. I have another perspective. I may be an objective outsider, but I'm not above my mentee in any great way. I have some experience to share, but then again, I don't know the uniqueness of the circumstances of my mentee. So I don't know what applies. And at the end of the mentoring session, I want the mentee to be taking the ownership, obviously, to be a free agent to make his or her decisions independently. That's a very egalitarian view of mentoring. From a more status conscious or more hierarchical, autocratic cultural perspective, the mentor is someone who knows best. It's an expert who shares a wealth of knowledge. It's like a fountain sharing, flowing over with sharing and insights and information. Of course, listening to the mentee's situation, but then tapping into experience base and say, if it was me, I would do this. Or in the past, I've experienced something similar, or I know of people who experienced something similar. Here's what works. So it's mentoring from a deep base of knowing, expertise, as compared to a more empowering egalitarian form of mentoring. This is a massive cultural differences that lives deep inside mentoring as a business activity, as a leadership activity. If someone from a more empowering, egalitarian cultural background is using that empowerment style in their mentoring, let's say too much, then someone from the other cultures, from a much more hierarchical, expert-based, status-conscious background, essentially would feel they know so much, but they're not giving it to me. They're not helping me. They're holding back, actually withholding information that's in their heads, in their hearts. And why are they holding it back? Why are they not trying to do their best to tell me what would be best for me and show me the way? I will learn from that and I'll grow from that if they just show the way. And vice versa, someone from a more egalitarian culture being mentored by a person with a more top-down, hierarchical, status-conscious, sort of autocratic mentoring approach, they would be like, why are you telling me what to do? Like, that's one way to do it. That's not helpful. That doesn't help me make that decision next time, understand why that's a good decision. So We can have a sparring session, we can have a discussion, but don't impose on me. Don't tell me what's best for me. I know what's best for me. I just need a sounding board, a sparring partner to discuss this with. So from both sides in a mentoring relationships, we can kind of make two mistakes. I sometimes think of, I call it theory of preferred mistake. Which mistake would I rather make? Because I don't always know where my mentee is, at least not early in the relationship. I can bring it up and have a conversation, but they may not even have an accurate self-perception to be able to articulate. Often we'll hear people on this particular dimension say, no, I love the empowerment, just give me the autonomy and the freedom. But then afterwards they tell us, well, I felt a little bit like I was left hanging there, like I was not being helped or served as much by the mentor as I thought they would be, with all the wealth of knowledge and experience that they have. So one mistake, or one thing to watch for, probably a better way to say it, is yes, people will say that they want more of the empowerment style, but that may mean, think of the cultural relativism of that. That may be, they don't want what their grandparents did to them, but they want somewhat in the direction of egalitarian. That doesn't mean that they need or want or benefit from or learn best through the more egalitarian style that we may be offering from the at least extreme egalitarian side of the dimension. In terms of dealing with this, so what I guess I'm proposing is that, yes, bring it up explicitly, have that conversation. That's maybe part of designing the mentoring relationship somehow, but be a little bit careful there, because it takes quite a global perspective from the mentor and the mentee to be able to have an accurate self-perception and be able to design from there. Another way to look at this is a much more situational, case-by-case logic, kind of situational leadership, if you will. Some questions or some sessions, some topics with the mentee, maybe you explicitly go in and say, hey, let me be directive for a moment. Let me propose a set of actions that would be helpful in this situation based on my life experience and my career. Here it is. And on the second topic, later in the same mentoring conversation, you explicitly say, well, in this particular case, I don't think my advice for you will necessarily be the best way. Let's discuss, let's reflect on pros and cons of different options. What are the alternatives? And what should we choose from there? So you understand, dear mentee, more of the reflections behind this. So let's have that conversation together. And at the end of that second part, if you will, the mentee's mentor says, I really don't know what's best for you, but I trust that you've looked carefully at both sides of this, or multiple sides of this, these options you have, and from there can decide what's best for you. And maybe there's a third point at the end of that mentoring session, within that same 45 minutes or an hour or whatever you have with them in that session. And you again go back to, you feel perhaps the mentee is really struggling. It's emotionally difficult. There's fear, uncertainty, deep ambiguity, and you bring that caring, loving, top-down. Some would use the word paternalistic here, but I'm a little careful with that, because that brings a really strong negative bias in more egalitarian cultures. But that caring, loving mentor who really says, I think I know what's best for you in this case. Follow my advice. Here's what I propose you do. So on the one hand, you can solve this cultural difference by being explicit. On the other hand, I'm proposing a case-by-case situational approach, adapting to the mentee's situation and style. Overall, you'll be under enormous pressure as mentees if you want to meet the mentor where they are, to find out, to read them accurately. Are they a little bit more on the empowerment side? Are they in the middle? Are they a little bit more on the autocratic side of this continuum? And then adjust your style comfortably. And comfortably is the difficult word here. So adjusting your style, yes, but can you hold it? Can you genuinely do it? Can you do it without frustration or difficulty, without acting and not being yourself? This is the real dilemma here. So what I'm after is really that over time as a mentor, when you look at these cultural differences, you develop like a range, a spectrum. that you're equally comfortable doing it one way or another way. That would be the dance, if you will, the cultural dance across the continuum of consensus empowerment versus autocratic, top-down, more status conscious mentoring. Have a think about what's really your style and how wide is your bandwidth, your flexibility, your spectrum on this continuum compared to the global cultural difference in play. Let me give a couple of other examples. So imagine the mentee is preparing for an important meeting, or they're going to give a big presentation, or maybe a difficult negotiation. One of the cultural differences that may show up is, we call it risk propensity. It's a little academic, but it's essentially a difference between some people being very comfortable with risk, uncertainty, ambiguity of a situation. They approach it by trial and error. There's okay to make a mistake here and there. You can always sort of correct and go from there. Versus people from more, call it high certainty seeking culture. So they're much more focused on making sure we get it right the first time, making sure that let's imagine we're doing a project. People from a high risk culture may have an attitude of after 30 minutes of discussing the project plan, they may say, well, I think in general we have an idea of where we're going, and we've talked this through enough. So as we go through, of course, there'll be a number of additions and corrections, but we're ready to press play and roll out this project plan. People from high certainty-seeking cultures, they're emotionally probably also ready to go. We can do that, not a problem. So it's not so much about being afraid of, it's not fear, but it could be fear as well, but it's not, culturally, it's not just about fear. They may have the attitude of, why don't we look over this one more time? Why don't we look at a backup plan? Why don't we discuss the details a little bit more to make sure that we're synchronized? Why don't we run a little pilot project, a little controlled experiment, if you will, before we roll out the whole project, just to get some additional learning to make sure that the plan we have actually is helpful. This is the difference culturally between high certainty and high risk. And it's really important, again, to think through as a mentor that I'm not just imposing my own, say, risk tolerance or my own approach to dealing with risk versus certainty when I'm mentoring a person from a very different cultural background. Classical example would be Japan globally, very, very high certainty-seeking behavior, but also Germanic cultures. Very focused on making sure that we have done things in the right way before we start. Then you would have other cultures around the world that are much more focused on, let's try it out, let's see how it goes. This could be, one example is actually the US or US American culture, where there's 80% is good enough, don't cry over spilled milk kind of attitude, but it could also be a local cultural attitude, perhaps across the Middle East, parts of Africa, where you just can't plan ahead in the same way. It doesn't make sense to plan ahead. It's more the ability to figure it out as you go along that's more powerful. So get into sort of combinations there in the Middle East cultural example. So for now, be aware, understand, appreciate that as a mentor, and make sure that you detect that there may be a difference between you and the mentee in how this is coming across. Another difference that's very often at play, and it goes to the heart of the mentoring relationship, is what we call task versus relationship. So mentors from certain task-oriented cultures would be pretty much diving in cold, if you will, getting started with very little or no relationship. They would focus on the task. We're here together to discuss this. Let's get started. Of course, there can be pleasantries. There can be a little introduction up front. But in relationship-oriented cultures, which, by the way, is 90% of the world's population, establishing that relationship is incredibly important for how we can work together, for openness, for trust, for connection, for intimacy, feeling safe in the relationship. So in some cultural contexts, it's happened through an introduction. So you're introduced by a third party, a go-between. But it could also be that you invest significant time in the relationship building up front. Getting to know each other, getting to know each other's backgrounds, getting to know each other personally, not just your CV or your resume, where you worked and for how long and the titles you've held, but really getting to know each other. What's the person behind that CV? What's the warm-blooded person that I'm interacting with? And the way it works in very relationship-oriented cultures often is that we give a little bit of a chance. We reveal a little bit of intimacy. We open up a little bit, and then we see how it's dealt with or treated by the other counterpart. So the trust building sort of layer after layer is happening over a significant period of time. Weeks, months, years, essentially. In a mentoring relationship, often there's a lot of practical frame holding, designing the mentoring collaboration somehow that's happening up front. And if we do too much of that, if we do that too soon, it can feel very impersonal to more relationship-oriented people. So what I would propose instead is to overinvest in the small talk, in the informal connection, in the getting to know each other, the revealing, the sharing, which will signal, or at least it's an invitation for, hey, I really want to get to know who you are. I want to get to know the whole you, and I care about you. So I'm investing in you. The Chinese talk about it as the guangxi, the guangxi account. You sort of input on the relationship account over a period of time. So at some point you may come and withdraw on the account, in the sense that you've established enough relationship to ask the difficult question or give the difficult feedback or ask for a favor or something, but you have to invest first before you can do this. Now, on the previous dimensions, I talked a little bit about now what are the tactics or the strategies. On this particular dimension, I'm going to be perhaps one-sided. My 20 plus years of working across cultures and cultural differences has led me to a very, very simple conclusion. You can make two mistakes on this dimension. The mistake number one would be that you are too task-oriented. You find out later that you don't have the intimacy of the relationship that you need in order to protect openness, honesty in the relationship, which is so important in a mentoring relationship. And the other mistake you can make is that you have wasted time over-investing in a relationship, and you find out afterwards that, okay, I overdid it. I didn't have to spend that much time on it. It's a waste of time. I think of it as theory of preferred mistake. Which of those two mistakes would you rather make? My experience tells me I would rather make the mistake of establishing too much relationship, over dialing on relationship building. So my advice is forget the formality for now. Just show up, connect, meet a new friend, a new person that you really care about. Or to avoid it sounding too egalitarian, if we're talking about relationship-oriented cultures, there's a correlation with hierarchy typically. So you are the uncle or the aunt, and you will meet the niece or the nephew, to use the metaphor. So show up, meet your new niece, meet your new nephew, and get to know them really, really well, and show that you care about them as people. And from there, you can slowly but surely start to move towards task. And it's not just, I don't want to make it sound like it's something you do the first time and then we're done with that and now we're going to be in task mode from there on. No, you continue, you stay in touch in between sessions perhaps. You establish a relationship where it's easy for them to reach out. I would highly recommend that you are informally chatting between sessions, so don't stick to this formality of containing it only in the sessions themselves. In a way, this goes against perhaps the mentoring training that you've received, or at least classical, let's say, Anglo-Saxon, Germanic, Nordic mentoring philosophy. But across cultures, mentoring across cultures, this is my sincere advice, that you cannot do enough relationship building. And one final argument. If I approach it from a task-oriented perspective or approach, and I get started and I'm into the topic and we're discussing something really difficult, I won't find out until much later that I don't have enough relationship established with this mentee to really get the whole story. They'll be holding back 10% that I'll never know, perhaps. If I go at it, as I recommend, from the relationship-oriented approach, relatively quickly in the conversation, when I'm small talking, relationship building, connecting, the mentee will sort of drift towards the task. So follow them at their pace, at the mentee's pace. I guess that's what I'm proposing, not at the mentor's pace, but adapt to the mentee. If they have learned, as many, for example, in the Global South has learned to be very task-oriented, because that's what's expected of them when they meet a mentor from a task-oriented culture, then I encourage you to, even if they ask for it, to hold it a little bit and say, hey, I'd really like to get to know you, and not just at a superficial level, but really get to know you. So that's task versus relationship. Very, very important for the mentoring relationship. The final cultural difference I want to focus on here in this video is a difference between individuals from cultures that have a strong preference for doing things by the manual, by the standard operating procedures, by the rules, by the laws, by the policies of the organization. The brain is wired, this is very hidden to them, they don't see themselves this way often, but the brain is wired in a way that they are expecting to synchronize working together with other people through this set of standardized, consistent ways of working. The alternative, or the other cultures, which again is a huge majority in the world's population, and by the way, most of, if not all, the cultures where MSF has missions, are operating on much more of a case-by-case logic or a case-by-case basis, much more particularistic, saying, yeah, the rule in general is like this, but in this particular situation, we may be doing something slightly differently. And one of the big differences between these two cultural styles is in the universalistic cultures, the leader or the mentor or the senior person is below the system, is below the rules and the guidelines. But in particularistic cultures, the leaders, at least, or people of a certain level in the organization, are above the rules and the guidelines and the policies, simply by the belief that we treat them as recommendations, as a starting point, and we made the rules so we can also change the rules. We can change it not just by going back to the drawing board and redraw a policy, but changing it on the spot in the situation, depending on what makes the most sense in that particular situation. So it's a judgment call. Now, this cultural difference is, I find it to be so hidden and concealed that most people's self-perception around this is, I was going to say non-extinct, but non-existing, but it's basically not very accurate. Cultural research on this particular dimension reveals that there's a strong tendency in Anglo-Saxon cultures, Germanic cultures, Nordic cultures to be very focused on consistency, whereas in varying degrees, the rest of the world is very focused on the case-by-case logic. In the context of the mentoring relationship, a mentor from the universalistic cultures mentoring a mentee from the particularistic cultures, there's a number of traps, there's a number of mistakes that can happen, or unfortunate situations that can unfold. First of all, the mentor can be too rigid in doing it the way it's supposed to be done. I like to recommend it this way. I hope it's helpful for you, but invent a new mentoring for every mentee. Just give yourself the freedom. You know what good mentoring looks like. You know what it looks like to you. And with this perspectives on how it could look differently to people around the world, from there, just focus on the individual mentee and invent whatever makes sense for them, whatever is best suitable for them. So if you have a certain number of sessions with a certain duration and a certain frequency between or time between sessions, that's great. And universalistic thinking will say this there for a reason, you should stick to it. Of course, you can make exceptions, but you're already trapped in the, oh, I can make an exception kind of mindset. In the particularistic, for a mentee that is from a particularistic culture or holds particularistic perspectives or values, it's absolutely not even necessary to mention that this is an exception. Just do what is right in that moment. You can change it later on. You can play with it. You can have agreed up front to do something, and then because something comes to your mind or you realize something along the way, you just change it. That flexibility, adaptability, whatever you want to call it, but that openness to doing whatever makes sense, ad hoc, case by case, is not only necessary sometimes in these cultures, but also very much appreciated. On the contrary, of course, if you are a mentor from a cultural background where this case by case logic is very dominant, just anticipate what it may be like for a mentee who expects a bit more of a clarity of the process that we're going to follow, and a bit more reflection, discussion, articulation, perhaps explicitly, about why we're making deviations here, why we're not following the guide or the manual or what they would probably talk about as best practices. So this is a discussion that is a Grand Canyon, a deep valley of difference between different cultures around the world. I focused here on 5 key dimensions that, in my experience with mentoring across cultures, probably has the biggest impact. This is what gets in the way of a successful mentoring relationship across cultures. Could say these are the differences that make a difference. There are a number of additional differences. I have provided a background reading document where you can read about another 5 dimensions, and there are obviously even more that can be researched and discussed. I would like to turn our attention now to what it takes to be successful in implementing this adaptation, this flexibility that I'm really calling for here, because our mentees may be all different culturally, that you as mentors, that we all as mentors are becoming super flexible. When we study what it takes to be successful across cultures, there are certain stages of development that we go through that I think can be helpful for you to keep in mind as you're mentoring another individual. Let me talk about, say, 6 different mentors. First mentor is perhaps completely in denial about cultural differences. Maybe he or she has never left his or her area in the world, never experienced other cultures. When exposed to a mentee that is doing things in a very different way than themselves, they probably just think it's a personality difference. They might not have a construct to think of it as culture. But other than that, they're just completely in denial about cultural differences. The second mentor is perhaps exposed to a number of cultural differences, but very quickly goes into an us versus them kind of mindset, into a polarization. And obviously they think their way is the best way and everyone else's way of thinking or interacting or leading or solving problems is simply not as successful as theirs. So they're biased, in other words. We call this polarization. The third mentor has sort of grown out of that strong polarization, still sees differences, but just doesn't think of it as a big deal. There are differences, probably slips back into right versus wrong on certain points, at least under pressure, but in general just says, yeah, it's not a big difference, it's just a small difference. And that allows them to kind of handle it. They can be okay with it. It's not a big deal. They'll probably think that I, in this video, are totally overdoing it. It's not that big a deal here. It's just a small difference. Yes, there are nuances, but essentially I can just be myself and get away with it that way. We call this minimization. They're minimizing the impact and the depth of the cultural differences. The fourth mentor sitting around the same table or being in the same room having this discussion is kind of it's a person who loves cultural differences. Probably they embrace it, they are aware of it, they understand it, they appreciate it, and they're just sitting there and just, isn't it amazing, the world is just so diverse and it's fantastic, I just love cultural differences. But they may still be at what I would call a relatively passive stage. So they're okay with it, they can label it, they can name it. When they find out that they made a cultural mistake, they're almost excited because this is super interesting. They just don't know what to do with it. So we need to get to the fourth stage, so the fifth state or the fifth mentor, in order to get to a person who can adjust his or her style to fit other people. Simply has enough bandwidth, as I pointed out a couple of times, flexibility, that they can adjust to another way of thinking, another way of working, another way of communicating. And I want to be precise here, because I'm not just talking about the skill. They can be indirect. They know how to build a relationship. It's much more the mental construct that they can be task-oriented and still think it's okay that some people are relationship-oriented, and I need to dance between those two. So they're okay with the construct. They're okay with the cultural differences at a much more embracing level. So here we're into deep adaptation. And for me, the highest state and the sixth person, the sixth mentor here in the way I'm building this story, is a mentor who not only can see that there is a difference between him, herself, and the mentee, but when the mentor describes a team of people working together where there's one Japanese, one from South Sudan, one from Brazil, and there's a Russian at the table, not only does this individual know how to adapt to each of these different cultural styles or profiles or ways of thinking, but when two or three other people are misaligned, the sixth mentor knows how to suggest a cross-culturally competent way to navigate through that complexity. Again, that's lifelong learning. That's a bar that I hold all of us to, but something we'll probably never achieve on all topics at any time. It's a really, really difficult ambition to carry. But when you look at, let me turn the camera on you for a second, yourself. Some of us will be in denial on certain topics. Some of us will be in polarization and get very quickly into a right versus wrong discussion and be super biased. Some of us will try to downplay a cultural difference, because if we really fathom the depth of what that really means, we can't even compute it, let alone know how to mentor or lead or join a team or recruit or whatever it may be that we're doing. So once we're operating in the acceptance, adaptation, and integration, I call integration the highest level, it's all about taking our cross-cultural knowledge and applying it to increase our own adaptability and flexibility as mentors. Ultimately, I think I mentioned it early on today, it doesn't matter so much what your style is. What matters, in my opinion, is what works for the mentee that you are supporting. That may call for enormous adaptation on your part, and it may call for incredible integration for you to figure out the cultural difference between your mentee and the counterparts that he or she is working with on a project, on a mission, and bring your advice, recommendation, good questions to be of value to them. That's our highest striving. So in summary, we've talked about what are some of the key differences between cultures around the world and what impact it may have for the mentoring success, for the mentoring relationship. I've given a number of examples, 5 key examples that I think are most important for successful mentoring across cultures. I've given hints along the way as to the tactics or strategies to make it successful in order to deal with the cultural difference between you and your mentee. And finally, we talked a bit about expanding our worldview to encompass, to be spacious enough for different cultural complexities. I would like to end by saying I hope I don't make it sound simple, because ultimately, I hope I don't make it sound too complex either, but ultimately the dilemma between being true to ourselves, be who you are, be authentic, versus adapting, being flexible, molding yourself to fit what works best for the mentee is a really tricky dilemma. None of us want to be acting, not be our true self, yet none of us want to be inflexible either. So the ability to adapt authentically to what is really helpful for the mentee is again a lifelong learning. So I hope this is helpful. I hope this is a good foundation for a discussion around how can we best support our mentees. The next step would be to refine or develop a very accurate self-perception. So know yourself really well in terms of what is your preference or bias or range on these cultural differences, and refine your ability to read your counterpart in every situation, your mentees, in every situation that they are faced with. And from there, design a tactic or a strategy that would be very successful for you, that you can implement in the mentoring relationship. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining. Good luck with the continued discussions and the wonderful work that you're doing in MSF in general and as mentors specifically.